This is AP Psychology, Chapter 5 on Sensation. Sensation is concerned with the outside world and gets represented inside our heads, and we are exquisitely sensitive to some stimuli around us. Research reveals that we process some information from subliminal stimuli, but only certain restricted conditions. The task of each sense is to receive stimulus energy, transduce it into neural signals, and send those neural messages to the brain. In vision, light waves are converted into neural impulses by the retina after being coded. These impulses travel up to the optic nerve to the brain's cortex, where they are interpreted. The Young-Helmholtz theory and opponent process theories together help explain how color vision works. In hearing, sound waves are transmitted in fluid-filled cochlea where they are converted to neural messages that are sent to the brain. Together, the place and frequency theories explain how we hear both high-pitched and low-pitched sounds. The sense of touch is actually four senses: pressure, warmth, cold, and pain. They combine to produce other sensations such as hot. Taste is a chemical sense is a composite of sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. Sensations and of aromas that interact with the information from the taste buds. Smell, also a chemical sense, does not have basic sensations as there are for touch and taste. Our affective functioning also requires a kinesthetic sense and a vestibular sense, which together enable us to detect body position and movement. So how do we construct our representations of the external world? To represent the world, we must detect physical energy of stimulus from the environment and convert it to neural signals. This is a process called sensation. When we select, organize, and interpret our sensation, that process is called perception. And we'll talk more about perception in the next chapter. Analysis of the stimulus begins with the sense receptors and work up to the level of the brain and mind. The letter A is really a black blotch broken down into features by the brain that we perceive as an A. Sensation is the process by which we detect physical energy from our environment and code it as neural signals. Bottom-up processing is the analysis that begins with the sense receptors and works up to the brain's integration of sensory information. Perception is the process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting sensory information, enabling us to recognize meaningful objects and events. Top-down processing is information processing guided by our experience and expectations. Top-down processing, information processing guided by the higher levels of mental processes as we construct perceptions, drawing on our experience and expectations. So as you can see here, it says the cat, because our mind is able to, from the top down, process this to what it should say. But actually, it's just two H's or H-like shapes. Our sensory and perceptual processes work together to help us sort out complex images. Senses are nature's gift that suit an organism's needs. A frog feeds on a flying insect. A male silkworm moth is sensitive to the female sex attractant odor, and we as humans are sensitive to sound frequencies that represent the range of the human voice. What stimuli cross our threshold for conscious awareness? Could we be influenced by stimuli too weak or subliminal to be perceived? And why are we unaware of unchanging stimuli like the Band-Aid on our skin? A study of relationships between the physical characteristics of stimuli and our psychological experiences with them. The physical world is represented by light, sound, pressure, and sugar. We recognize these as brightness, volume, weight, and sweet in our psychological world. A relative increase in mental intensity was realized might be measured in terms of relative increase of physical energy required to bring it about. In the pioneering study of the relationship between physical energy and the psychological experience, Gustav Fechner, 1801 to 1887, was acting to promote his belief that every person, animal, and plant in the universe is composed of both matter and soul. Although trained in medicine, Fechner soon turned his attention to physics and mathematics and held a professorship at the University of Leipzig. As part of his research, he discovered that after staring at the sun for a period of time, he would see an after image, blue in the complement of yellow. He began to devote all his time to the psychological research. Although his findings were well received, the work led him to suffer from photophobia, an emotional collapse. Virtually blind, he spent a long period of time in a darkened room. Morton Hunt reports that he was tormented by pain and emotional stress, intolerable boredom, and severe digestive problems. He eventually began to improve and to see again without pain. As he emerged from his room, he walked into a garden where the flowers appeared brighter, more beautiful, and more intensely colored than ever before. This led him to write a book about the mental life of plants. For the rest of his life, he sought to promote his theory that consciousness and matter coexist throughout the world. Hunt describes how this mystical notion led Fechner to his historic work in experimental psychology. Lying in bed on the morning of October 22, 1850, wondering how to prove that the mind and body are two aspects of fundamental unity, Fechner had a sudden insight. He thought if somehow he could show a consistent mathematical relationship between the force of stimuli and the intensity of the situations they produce, he would have established the identity of body and mind. Fechner asked an important question: is there a consistent mathematical relationship between the magnitude of stimulus and the magnitude of sensation it creates? Although he could measure stimulus intensely directly, Fechner thought he faced an enormous problem in measuring sensations. They are subjective. Finally, he realized he could do so indirectly by using sensitivity as the guide. He could determine the smallest increase in stimulus strength that would be just barely noticeable to the subject. Just barely noticeable meant that the same thing at any level. That measurement of sensation could be compared with the increase in stimulus necessary to produce the awareness. The three methods of experimental measurement used by Fechner continue to be used by psychophysical research. In the method of limits, the researcher begins with a minimal stimulus and increases it until the subject can perceive it. To determine a just noticeable difference, the researcher presents a standard stimulus and a comparison stimulus, and increases the difference between them by small steps until the subject says it is perceptible. In the method of right and wrong cases, the experimenter presents identical stimuli repeatedly, either single stimuli at the threshold or pairs of stimuli that are very similar. The subject responds yes if she perceives it, or two are different, or no if he does not perceive it, or the two are not different. The responses yield averages, and these tell how likely it is that at any given stimulus level or difference between stimuli, the subject will perceive the stimulus or the difference. In the method of adjustment, the researcher or subject adjusts a comparison stimulus. It appears identical to the standard stimulus. Of course, there is always a small margin of error. Every error is recorded, and after many trials, the average error is computed. It provides a measure of just noticeable difference. In recognizing Fechner's contribution, the great historian of psychology, Edwin Boring, writes, Fechner, because of what he did at the time, which he did it, set experimental quantitative psychology off upon the course which it has followed. One may call him the founder of experimental psychology, or one may assign that title to Wundt. It does not matter. Fechner had a fertile idea which grew and brought forth fruit abundantly. So this is how the detection system works. You see here the intensity, and they will go through it where the subject will say, no, I don't see a difference. No, I don't see a difference. No, I don't see a difference. Yes, now I see a difference. And yes, clearly a difference. This becomes your absolute threshold. The absolute threshold minimum stimulation needed to detect a particular stimulus is 50% of the time. The subliminal threshold is one's absolute threshold for conscious awareness. In studying the relationship between physical energy and the psychological experiences, researchers in psychophysics identified an absolute threshold as the minimum stimulation needed to detect a particular stimulus 50% of the time. Signal detection theory predicts that when and how we detect the presence of a faint stimulus, assuming that our individual absolute thresholds vary with our psychological state. The priming effect in our experiments reveal that we can process some information from stimuli too weak to recognize, but the restricted conditions under which this occurs would not enable advertisers to exploit us as subliminal messages. The difference threshold is the minimum difference between the two stimuli required for detection of time, also called the just notable difference. So here we see where they go, no, no, yes, yes. So the difference threshold becomes 50% of the time. A difference threshold is the minimum difference between two stimuli that a person can detect 50% of the time. In humans, difference thresholds experienced as just noticeable difference increase in proportion to the size of a stimulus. This is a principle known as Weber's law. The two stimuli must differ by a constant minimum percentage rather than a constant amount, perceived as Weber's fraction. Now, typically, our difference for light is there needs to be an 8% change in light. For weight, there needs to be 2% change in weight, and for tone, a 3% change. Weber's law can be applied to many situations. For example, $10 per hour worker may require a 50-cent pay raise to notice a difference. A $20 an hour worker may need to receive a $1 raise to notice. Robert Ciandi illustrates the principle for sales. Assume a man wants to buy a three-piece suit and a sweater. If you were the salesperson, which should you show him first in order to get him to spend the most money? You might think that best to sell the sweater first. Having spent a lot on a suit, the customer might be reluctant to spend more on the sweater. However, sales motivation analysts suggest the opposite. Sell the suit first because the additional cost of a sweater will not be so readily noticed. If the man has just paid $300 for a suit and an additional $75 for a sweater will not seem excessive. The same applies to other accessories, such as shirt or shoes. As a rule, people will almost always pay more for accessories if they buy them after rather than before the more expensive purchase. The sample principle holds for the purchase of accessories on a new car. After paying $25,000 for the car, the customer hardly noticed the $500 for an FM radio. The trick, of course, is to mention these accessories independently so that each addition will seem negligible in comparison to the much larger commitment already made. Signal detection theory predicts how and when we detect the presence of a faint stimulus. signal amid the background noise and other stimulation. Signal detection theory assumes that there is no single absolute threshold detection depends on. Things that will affect the signal detection theory are a person's experience, their expectations, their motivation, and their level of fatigue. The signal detection matrix works like this. The observer decides whether she or hears the tone or not, and based on signal being present or not, this translates into one of four outcomes. If the sound is present, it's either a hit or a miss. If it's absent, it's either a false alarm or a correct rejection. Sensory adaptation refers to the diminished sensitivity that is a consequence of constant stimulation. The phenomenon of sensory adaptation enables us to focus our attention on informative changes in our environment without being distracted by uninformative constant stimulation of garments, odors, and street noise, for example. So the diminished sensitivity is a consequence of constant stimulation. That's why when you put on a Band-Aid on your arm and after a while you don't even sense it's there. Transduction is the sensation, the transformation of stimulus energy into neural impulses. Phototransduction is the conversion of light energy into neural impulses that the brain can understand. Transduction is the process by which our sensory systems encode stimulus energy and neural impulses. In vision, we convert light energy into neural impulses. The energies we experience as visible light are a thin slice of the broad spectrum of the electromagnetic radiation. Our sensory experience of light is determined largely by the light's energy wavelength, which determines the hue or color, and its intensity, which influences brightness. Light characteristics. Light comes in wavelength, intensity, and saturation. Wavelength is known as hue or color. Intensity is brightness, and saturation is its purity. Hue or color is the dimension of color determined by the wavelength of light. Short wavelength equals high frequency and has bluish colors and higher pitch sounds. Long wavelength, there's low frequency sounds and reddish colors. Wavelength is the distance from the peak of one wave to the peak of the next. The wavelength hue is violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. And if you read this backwards, it's Roy G. Biv. And so this is how you can remember these colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Roy G. Biv. These are the different wavelengths of light that result in different colors. Intensity or brightness. Intensity is the amount of energy in a wave determined by the amplitude. It is related to perceived brightness. The great amplitude and bright colors is loud sounds, big waves. Small amplitude and dull colors are soft sounds. Intensity or brightness. The blue color with varying levels of intensity. As intensity increases or decreases, the blue color looks more washed out. Purity or saturation. The more it becomes saturated, monochromatic light added to green and red makes them less saturated. The color solid represents all three characteristics of light stimulus on this model. Transduction is the process by which our sensory systems encode stimulus energy as neural messages. In vision, we convert light energy into neural impulses. The energies we experience as visible light are a thin slice of the broad spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. Our sensory experience of light is determined largely by the light energy's wavelength. After light enters the eye through the pupil, whose size is regulated by the iris, a camera-like lens focuses the rays by changing its curvature, a process called accommodation on the retina. This light-sensitive surface contains receptors that are processing visual information. Acuity or sharpness of vision can be affected by small distortions in the shape of the eye. In nearsightedness, nearby objects are seen more clearly than distant objects because the lens focuses the image of distant objects in front of the retina. In farsightedness, faraway objects are seen more clearly than near objects because the image of near objects is focused behind the retina. So the cornea is a transparent tissue where the light enters the eye. The iris muscle then expands to contracts the change of the pupil's opening pupil for light. The lens focuses the light rays on the retina, and the retina contains sensory receptors that process visual information and sends it to the brain. The lens is transparent structure behind the pupil that changes shape to focus images. Accommodation is a process by which the eye's lens changes shape to help focus near and far objects. After the light enters through the pupil, whose size is regulated, acuity or sharpness of vision can be affected by small distortions in the shape of the eye. In nearsightedness, nearby objects are seen more clearly than distant objects because the lens focuses the image on the distant objects in front of the retina. In farsightedness, faraway objects are seen more clearly than near objects because the image of near objects is focused on behind the retina. The retina is the light-sensitive inner surface of the eye, containing receptor rods and cones in addition to layers of other neurons, the bipolar ganglion cells, the process of visual information. The retina's rods and cones, most of which are clustered around the fovea, transduce the light into neural signals. These signals activate neighboring bipolar cells, which in turn activate the neighboring ganglion cells, whose axons converge to form the optic nerve that carries the information to the brain, where the optic nerve leaves the eye and there are no receptor cells, creating a blind spot. The cones enable the vision of color and fine detail. The rods detect black, white, and gray, and remain sensitive in dim light and are necessary for peripheral vision. So the optic nerve carries these neural impulses from the eye to the brain. The blind spot is the point where the optic nerve leaves the eye because there are no receptor cells located there. This creates a blind spot. The fovea is the central point in the retina around which the eye's cones cluster. So in your textbook, you'll see this same picture, and you can do this by use your textbook and you close your left eye and you fixate your right eye on the black dot. At some point, the car will disappear into a blind spot. Photoreceptors are located in the retina. Bipolar cells receive messages from the photoreceptors and transmit them to the ganglion cells, which are for the optic nerve. The optic nerves connect the thalamus in the middle of the brain, and the thalamus connects to the visual cortex. The retinal ganglion cells and the thalamic neurons break down visual stimuli into components and have receptive fields with the center surround organization. We process information at progressively more abstract levels. The information from the retina is 130 million rods and cones is received and transmitted by million or so ganglion cells whose axons make up the optic nerve. When the individual ganglion cells register information in their region of the visual field, they send signals to the visual cortex. In the cortex, individual neurons, feature detectors, respond to the specific features of a stimulus. The visual cortex passes this information along to other areas of the cortex, which includes higher level of brain cells that respond to specific visual scenes. Other supercell clusters integrate the information and combine it with other assumptions, interests, and expectations. So nerve cells in the visual cortex respond to these specific features such as edges, angles, and movement. Specific combinations of temporal lobe activity occur as people look at shoes, faces, chairs, and houses. Our perceptions are a combination of sensory bottom-up and cognitive top-down processing. Visual information processing of several aspects of stimulus simultaneously is called parallel processing. The brain divides a visual scene into subdivisions as color, depth, movement, etc. Subdimensions of vision, color, movement, depth, and form are processed by our neural teams, working separately and simultaneously, illustrating our brain's capacity for parallel processing. Other teams collaborate in integrating the results, comparing them with stored information, and enabling perceptions. This contrasts sharply with the step-by-step serial processing of most computers and of conscious problem solving. Some people who have lost part of their visual cortex experience blind sight. Those with blind sight, argues Marcel of Cambridge University, have superb vision. But they do not know that they can see. Employing a high-speed camera, Marcel tracked the vectors of subjects' arms, hands, and fingers as they reached for objects they could not consciously see. The films indicate that their reach was quite precise. This suggests that their vision remains intact. Only the neural areas that bring vision into awareness are impaired. Psychologist Lawrence Weiser-Krantz and his colleagues at Oxford University have investigated blind sight extensively. They report, for example, that 20 years ago, a young male patient who had lost their left half of his vision because of damage to the visual cortex could nonetheless identify things in the blind field. For instance, he could distinguish between X and an O and tell whether a line was vertical or horizontal. However, he did this only when researchers urged him to guess. He'd be astonished that his answers were correct. I couldn't see anything, not a darn thing. Researchers disagree on the cause of blind sight. Research has indicated that certain animals can see without a visual cortex. They use more primitive visual processing center. While primitive structures may still provide information about the location of objects, it does it does so below the level of awareness. Weisskranz argues that the blind sight is similarly produced portions of the brain other than primary visual cortex. He notes that the fat bundles of fibers from each optic nerve never reach the visual cortex, but instead travel to the midbrain, which controls involuntary unconscious actions. Other fibers bypass the primary visual cortex and enter into different cortical regions. These regions may produce the unconscious vision. Michael Gazzaniga of the University of California, Davis has challenged the notion that blind sight is derived from visual pathways diverted to the midbrain. He reports discovering that a patient with blind sight has live functioning neurons in the portion of the visual cortex that presumably had been destroyed. These islands of healthy tissue, argues Gazzaniga, account for the blind sight, because the preserved areas are so slight that the signals patients receive are too small to trigger conscious reaction. Gazzaniga does not find this surprising. Lots of studies suggest that we're not consciously aware of what goes on in the cortex. Probably a good deal of our psychological life, Weisskranz acknowledges that there may well be individual cases in which the ability to make visual discrimination is the result of small intact islands of vision, but he says this is not always true. He cites the case of G.Y., a patient who demonstrated blind sight. According to Weisskranz, G.Y.'s ability to respond to pathways of movement with perfect accuracy would require many widely distributed intact islands. Yet a high-resolution MRI scan revealed only a small patch of intact visual cortex near the back of the brain. A PET scan also found no activity in the visual cortex as GY viewed a moving visual display. However, the scan detected activity in the visual association areas and the other brain regions. Trichromatic theory, based on behavioral experiments of Helmholtz, suggested that the retina should contain 3 receptors that are sensitive to red and blue in green colors. If the 3 primary color pigments are mixed, the subtraction of all wavelengths occur in black as the result. If 3 primary colors of lights are mixed, the wavelengths are added and the color white is the result. The Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory states that the retina has 3 types of color receptors, each especially sensitive to red, green, and blue. When we stimulate the combination of these cones, we see other colors. For example, when red and green sensitive cones are stimulated, we see yellow. This additive coloring mixing differs from the subtractive color mixing of paints. McNoll, Wald, and Brown measured directly the absorption spectra of visual pigments of single cones obtained from the retinas of humans. Herring's opponent process theory states that there are 2 additional color processes, one responsible for red versus green perception and one for yellow versus blue, plus a third black versus white process. Subsequent research has confirmed that after leaving the receptor cells and the visual information is analyzed in terms of opponent colors, red and green, blue and yellow, and black and white. Thus, in the retina, in the thalamus, some neurons are turned on by red but turned off by green. Others are turned on by green but off by red. These opponent processes help explain after images. Color constant refers to our perceiving of familiar objects as having a consistent color, even if changing. illumination alters the wavelength reflected by the object. We see color as a result of our brain's computations of light reflected by any object relative to its surrounding. So color blindness is a genetic disorder in which people are blind to green and red colors. This supports the trichromatic theory. Opponent processes. So what you want to do in this activity is gaze at the middle of the flag for about 30 seconds. When it disappears, stare at the dot and report whether you see Britain's flag. So that should have worked for you. The opponent process theory presented by Herring proposed that we process 4 primary colors combined in pairs of red, green, blue, yellow, and black and white. Blue and yellow, red and green, black and white. Color constantly of an object remains the same under different illuminations. However, when context changes, the color of an object may look different. So now we'll get into audition or sound. Audition or hearing is highly adaptive. This pressure waves we experience as sound vary in amplitude, frequency, and correspondingly in perceived loudness and pitch. Decibels are measured units for sound energy. So sound waves are composed of compression, rarefaction of air molecules, the acoustical transduction conversion of sound waves into neural impulses in the hair cells of the inner ear. So with sound characteristics, our frequency equals pitch, intensity equals loudness, quality equals timbre. Frequency pitch, the dimension of frequency determined by the wavelength of the sound. Short wavelength equals high frequency and bluish colors and high-pitched sounds. Wavelength is the distance from the peak of one wave to the peak of the next. Long wavelengths equals low frequency, reddish colors equal low pitch sounds. Intensity, the amount of energy in a wavelength determined by the amplitude, relates to perceived loudness. Great amplitude, bright colors, loud sounds. Small amplitude, dull colors, soft sounds. The loudness of sounds, as you can see here, is a scale typically of common sounds that we might hear. Our threshold of hearing would be 0. A whisper would be considered 20 decibels. The typical room noise is 40 decibels. Normal conversation is 60 decibels. Busy street corner might be 80 decibels. A subway train would be at 20 feet would be 100 decibels. A jet plane at 500 feet away would be 110 decibels. Loud thunder would be 120 decibels, and then a rock band amplified at close range in the club is going to be 140 decibels, showing you that you play your music too loud. Quality of sound is called timbre. The characteristic of that sound from the zither and a guitar allows the ear to be able to distinguish the two different instruments. Overtones makes the distinction among musical instruments possible. The sine wave, the violin, and then the piano. The ear, this is the structure of the ear. The visible outer ear channels the sound wave through the auditory canal to the eardrum. A tight membrane that vibrates the waves is transmitted via the bones of the middle ear, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup to the fluid-filled cochlea in the inner ear. These vibrations create movement in tiny hair cells on the basilar membrane, triggering a neural message to be sent via the thalamus to the auditory cortex in the brain. So the outer ear, also known as the pinna, collects the sound. The middle ear is the chamber between the eardrum and the cochlea. It contains 3 tiny bones, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. These concentrate the vibrations of the eardrum on the cochlea's oval window. The inner ear is the innermost part of the ear, and it contains the cochlea, the semicircular canals, and the vestibular sacs. The cochlea is a coiled-filled bony fluid-filled tube in which the inner ear transforms sound vibrations into auditory signals. Place theory suggests that the sound frequencies stimulate the basilar membrane at specific places, resulting in a perceived pitch. So place theory would indicate that there are certain parts of the cochlea that are indicating the sound. Frequency theory states that the rate of nerve impulse traveling up the auditory nerve frequency of a tone thus enables us to sense its pitch. Place theory presumes that we hear different pitches because different sound waves trigger activity at different places along the cochlear's basilar membrane. Thus, the brain can determine a sound's pitch by recognizing the place on the membrane from which it receives neural signals. Frequency theory states that the rate of nerve impulses traveling up the auditory nerve matches the frequency of a tone, thus enabling us to sense its pitch. The Volley principle explains hearing sounds with frequency at 1,000 waves per second. Place theory explains best how we sense high-pitched sounds, and frequency theory best explains how we sense low-pitched sounds. Some combination of the two theories explains sounds in between. Sound waves strike one ear sooner and more intensely than the other ear. We localize sound by detecting the minute differences in the intensity and timing of the sounds received by each ear. And so your head acts as a shadow for that sound. Localization is the intensity differences, time differences as small as 1/100th of a second can cause us to be able to localize the sound. The head acts as a shadow or a partial sound barrier. Hearing loss is a conduction hearing loss caused by the damage to the mechanical system that conducts sound waves to the cochlea. Sensorineural hearing loss is caused by damage to the cochlea's receptor cells or to the auditory nerve, also called nerve deafness. Problems with the mechanical system that conducts the sound wavelengths to the cochlea cause conduction hearing loss. If the eardrum is punctured or if the tiny bones in the middle ear lose their ability to vibrate, the ear's ability to conduct vibration diminishes. Digital hearing aids may restore hearing by amplifying vibrations for frequencies and by compressing sound. Damage to the cochlea's hair cell receptors for their associated nerves could cause sensorineural hearing loss. Once destroyed, these tissues remain dead, although hearing aid may amplify sound to stimulate other hair cells. disease, biological changes linked with aging, or prolonged exposure to ear-splitting noise or music may cause sensorineural hearing loss. Older people tend to hear low frequencies well, but suffer hearing loss when listening to high frequencies. Cochlear implants are electronic devices that enable the brain to hear sounds. Those who live with hearing loss face social challenges. Cochlear implants are wired into various sites on the auditory nerve, allowing them to transmit electrical impulses to the brain. They enable some hearing by deaf children, but deaf culture advocates, noting that the sign is a complete language, question the enhancement. Some also argue that sensory compensation, which enhances other senses, gives deaf people advantages that hearing does not. 18-year-olds are past the age of childhood ear infections that can adversely affect hearing, but are still too young to be suffering the effects of aging. Assuming that 18-year-olds should have the best hearing around, the researchers in the 1930s and 50s tested them to set the standard for what the human ear can hear. By 1969, the summer Woodstock audiologist David Lipscomb found that 1/3 of incoming freshmen tested at the University of Tennessee showed signs of hearing loss. 1 in 8 students had damage severe enough to interfere with communication. A more recent study for the University of Tennessee's Noise Laboratory indicated that 60% of American college students suffer from some high-frequency hearing loss. Researchers immediately suspected that the loud music was the culprit. Live concerts commonly reach sound levels above 120 decibels, louder than a jackhammer or a chainsaw. According to the standards set by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, exposure to sound levels of 85 decibels, comparable to the sound of a food processor, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, will eventually cause permanent hearing loss. In most people, for each 5 decibel increase, the time it takes to cause a lasting injury drops by half. At 120 decibels, some damage can result in a relatively short time. One ear specialist suggests that following do-it-yourself tests for hearing, hold your hand up to your shoulder as if you were taking a courtroom oath. Then rub your hand and forefinger together. If you don't clearly hear the high-pitched scritching sound, you may have some hearing loss in that ear. It's important that the test is not perfect, and it is best at identifying hearing loss at middle and low frequencies. Students who fail the test should try again in a day or two, since ears vary sensitivity from day to day. Nearby noise or static on a line may also interfere. Over 35 million Americans suffer some hearing loss, making the most common physical disability. In industrial societies, people gradually lose sensitivity to high frequencies, a condition called presbycusis. The selective high-frequency deafness begins at a very early age. According to one survey, most 30-year-olds are unable to hear the frequencies above 15,000 hertz. By age 50, hearing beyond 12,000 hertz is lost. By 70 years of age, the cutoff falls to 6,000 hertz, a value within the range of normal speech. At every age, men exhibit a greater degree of cumulative effects of loud noise account for steady hearing loss. Others believe it is the result of age-related changes in the cochlea that restrict blood to the delicate neural elements in the inner ear. Ringing in the ears or tinnitus affects more than 36 million Americans. Almost the most common cause is exposure to loud noise. The disorder may be produced by certain drugs, ear infections, or food allergies. Jack Vernon, director of the Kresge Hearing Research Laboratory at the University of Oregon, suggests that tinnitus is the third worst thing that can happen to us. ranking only below intractable severe pain and intractable severe dizziness. Its severe forms, tinnitus, is totally incapacitating, making it impossible for people to concentrate enough to complete a task. Some people gain relief by using a tinnitus masker worn like a hearing aid. It produces a sound like a waterfall or a hiss of an FM radio tuned between stations. One sense of touch is actually four senses. Pressure, warmth, cold, and pain that combine to produce other sensations such as hot. There is no simple relationship between what we feel and type of specialized nerve ending found there. Only pressure has identified receptors. All other skin sensations are variations of pressure, warmth, cold, and pain. Bruce Goldstein cites two wonderful examples of the amazing human capacity of touch. That blind from the age of 4 in the Netherlands, Gert Verman came with his family to the United States at an early age and studied in both residential and regular schools. Before attending Princeton, during his senior year, he applied to graduate school to pursue evolutionary biology with a specialty in mollusks. Most told him that his blindness would make such a study impossible. Edgar Boll, a Yale, finally granted an interview. He took Verman to the museum, introduced him to the curator. He gave him a shell. Verman relates what happened. Here's something. Do you know what it is? Boll asked as he handed me a specimen. My fingers and mind raced. Widely separated ribs parallel to the outer lip, large aperture, low spire, glossy ribs reflected backward. It's a harpa, I replied tentatively. It must be a harpa major. Right so far. How about this one? Inquired Boll, as another fine shell changed hands. Smooth, sleek, channeled suture, narrow opening. Could be any olive. It's an olive. I'm pretty sure it's an olive cyana, the common one from Florida, but they all look alike. Both men were momentarily speechless. They had planned this little exercise all along to call my bluff. Now that I had passed, Boll had undergone an instant metamorphosis. Beaming with enthusiasm and warmth, he promised me his full support. Goldstein explains that Verman graduated with a PhD and became a professor of geology at the University of California and editor of the scientific journal Evolution. Through his exquisite sense of touch, he focuses on physical characteristics of shells and necessarily ignores extraneous visual details. Ironically, this has enabled him to surpass many of his sighted colleagues. Braille, the system of raised dots that allows blind people to read with their fingers, provides another example of remarkable capabilities of touch. The Braille alphabet consists of raised dots in a 2x3 matrix. There are characters for each letter of the alphabet and 4 numbers, punctuation marks, and common speech sounds and words. Until Louis Braille introduced this system to the students of Paris School for the Young Blind in 1824, the only reading material available to the blind were a few books that embossed the shapes of conventional letters onto the page. They were rarely read because each letter had to be laboriously scanned to determine its complete shape. Although the dots eliminated this problem, many sighted educators thought it absurd to teach blind such a different and difficult system. Nonetheless, blind students loved it, and in 1854 the system was officially recognized in France. Those who have learned the system can read at a rate of 100 words per minute. This speed is particularly impressive given that the touch of raised dots must be transformed into vast amounts of information that go well beyond simply sensations to the skin. Pain is an alarm system that draws our attention to some physical problems. There is no one type of stimulus that triggers pain. There's no special receptor for pain. At low intensities, the stimuli may produce pain or cause other sensations, including warmth or coolness, something or roughness. The gate control theory of pain is that a gate in the spinal cord either opens to permit pain and signals traveling of small nerve fibers to reach the brain, or closes to prevent their passage. The biopsychosocial approach views pain not only as product of biological influence, but also as a result of psychological influences such as the situation and our past experiences, and social influences such as cultural expectations and the presence of observers. Pain is controlled through a combination of medical and psychological treatments. Pain tells the body that something has gone wrong. Usually pain results from damage to the skin and other tissues. A rare disease exists in which afflicted person feels no pain. There's the biopsychosocial influences. The activity in the spinal cord is large and small fibers, genetic differences, endorphin production, and the brain's interpretation of the central nervous system. Psychological influences, attention to pain, learning based on experience, expectation of pain relief. And then there's social cultural influences, the presence of others, empathy for others, and cultural expectations. Melzik and Wall proposed that our spinal cord contains neurological gates that either block pain or allow it to be sensed. Pain can be controlled by a number of therapies, including drugs, surgery, acupuncture, exercise, hypnosis, and even thought distraction. Ronald Melzik and Patrick Wall's gate control theory explains how the experience of pain can be influenced by information from the brain, as these brain to spinal cord messages can be deterred by psychological factors. For example, the hook swinging ceremony practiced in parts of India is a graphic demonstration of the affected culture of pain perception. Melzik and Wall described the ceremony as follows. The ceremony derives from an ancient practice in which a member of the social group is chosen to represent the power of the gods. The role of the chosen man, or celebrant, is to bless the children and the crops in a series of neighboring villages during a particular period of the year. What is remarkable about the ritual is the steel hooks, which are attached by strong ropes to the top of a special cart and are shoved under his skin and muscles on both sides of his back. The cart is then moved from village to village. Usually the man hangs onto the ropes as the cart is moved about, but at the climax of this ceremony in each village he swings free, hanging only from the hooks embedded in his back, to bless the children and the crops. Astonishingly, there is no evidence that the man is in pain during the ritual. Rather, he appears to be in a rare state of exaltation. Oftentimes, sports injuries may go unnoticed until well after the game. In 1996, gymnast Carrie Strug secured a gold medal for the U.S. Olympic team by completing her last vault on a badly sprained ankle. And as indicated in Chapter 2, these resources fall. The Philadelphia quarterback Donovan McNabb threw 4 touchdown passes while playing with a broken ankle. H.K. Beecher found only 25% of men seriously injured in battle requested narcotic for pain relief, but over 80% of civilians who were about to undergo major surgery requested painkillers. Soldiers knew that their wounds would provide escape from the hazardous battlefield to hospital safety. The stress of combat may have also contributed to their relative insensitivity to pain. Research also indicates that when surgical patients were told what to expect following surgery and to relax to reduce their pain, they needed fewer painkillers and were sent home 2.7 days earlier than a control group. Finally, research indicates that up to 35% of patients with pathological pain obtain relief from a placebo that contains no active ingredients. All these examples show that there is more to pain than what stimulates the sense receptors. Traditionally, taste sensations consisted of sweet, salty, sour, bitter taste. Recently, the receptors of the fifth taste have been discovered, called umami. Taste is a chemical sense, is a composite of sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami sensations, and of the aromas that interact with the information from our taste buds. Taste buds on the top and sides of the tongue and in the back of the roof of the mouth contain taste receptor cells. These cells send information to an area of temporal lobe near the area where olfactory information is received. Sensory interaction refers to the principle that one sense may influence another, as well as the smell of food influences its taste. When one sense affects another sense, we have sensory interaction that takes place. So the taste of strawberry interacts with smell and its texture on the tongue to produce flavor. Like taste, smell is a chemical sense. Odorants enter the nasal cavity to stimulate 5 million receptors, which is the sense of smell. Animals tend to be neophobic, that is, suspicious of novel things. This makes evolutionary sense in that it helps them to avoid poisonous food. Typically, an animal will try only a small portion of a foreign substance to see if it produces sickness. Humans, especially children, also tend to be suspicious of novel things. Psychologists Marcia Pelchant and Patricia Pliner devised an experiment to find out whether it is the novelty of food or something else that prompts people to spurn it. They gave two groups of people identical foods. When the foods were accurately named, chopped tomatoes, oatmeal, beefsteak, the subjects were quite willing to taste them. When the foods were referred to as pendula fruit or lot and languna steaks, subjects were far less cooperative. However, as is true, other stimuli, mere exposure to new foods, tend to make us like them better. Try it, you'll like it, works much of the time. Recently, researchers at Monell Chemical Senses Center in Philadelphia reported that babies' first foods may determine taste later in life. They fed 53 two-week-old babies one of two infant formulas, a sweet, milky formula or a sour-tasting one with an unpleasant aftertaste. After being fed one or the other for 7 months, the babies were offered both formulas. Those who had been given the sour-tasting formula were quite happy to keep drinking it. Those who were accustomed to the sweet formula turned up their noses at the alternative. For kids to develop preferences for healthy foods, they may need to be introduced to those foods early in life. Conditioned taste aversion, discussed in Chapter 8, provide good examples of how experience shapes taste preferences. Howard Moskowitz and his colleagues described the role experience plays in shaping taste preferences. Like most of us, Indian medical students describe citric acid as being sour and quinine as bitter. Indians of Kartanka province, however, found both to be pleasant. Why? Perhaps because the diet consisted of many sour foods, with the tamarind, a particular sour fruit, making up a large portion of it. Being poor, they ate the tamarind out of necessity. From constant exposure to this fruit, they may have acquired a taste for sour foods. Smell is also a chemical sense, but without any basic sensations. The 5 million olfactory receptor cells recognize the individual odor molecules. With some odors triggering a combination of receptors, the receptor cells send messages to the olfactory lobe, then to the temporal lobe and to parts of the limbic system. An odor's ability to spontaneously evoke memories is due in part to the close connections between brain areas that process smell and those involved in memory storage. For decades, researchers have known that animals secrete and detect chemical messengers known as pheromones. Originally discovered in insects, pheromones are best known for their role in attracting members of the opposite sex. In the 1930s, investigators reported that female moths were able to excite males even when the males could not see or hear them. The males apparently detected the smell with extraordinary sensitive antennae. Fragrance concentrations of less than 1/300 millionth of an ounce could stimulate millions of moths. Subsequent research has indicated that the pheromones could provide animals with information about each other's identity and produce hormonal changes that stimulate ovulation, promote or inhibit sexual maturation, precipitate abortion, and even stop aggression. Most mammals seem to detect pheromones through the olfactory system as well as the vomeronasal organ, VNO, a proposed organ located in the nose which detects pheromones and communicates information about them to the hypothalamus, where certain pheromones might affect such things as an infant's recognition of its mother's or adult's choice of mates. Researchers have identified two types of pheromones in mammals. Primer pheromones produce changes in an endocrine system of receiving animals. For example, young female mice exposed to chemical signals of adult males mature more quickly. Releaser pheromones elicit specific behavioral patterns. Male hamsters are attracted by the secretion of females release in greatest amount just before they ovulate. Are there human pheromones? The most promising evidence comes from researchers investigating the menstrual synchrony in women who live or work together. Nearly 30 years ago, Martha McClintock, then at Wesley College undergraduate, noticed that women in her dormitory often developed remarkably similar menstrual patterns. For other species, this synchrony has a survival value. When you see others successfully rearing young, McClintock says, it means it's a good time for you too. Now a psychologist at the University of Chicago, McClintock and colleague Kathleen Stern recruited a group of 29 women and asked 9 of them to wear pads under their arms for several hours, either before or just after ovulation. When pads were then wiped under the noses of other women, the results were startling. Smelling the revulsion, smelling re-ovulation pads shortened their menstrual cycles by as many as 14 days, while ovulation phase pads increased cycles by as many as 12 days. McClintock is continuing her research with an eye on possible applications. Pheromone treatments designed to regulate ovulation could serve as fertility enhancers for couples who want to conceive and as contraceptives for those who do not. Most recently, McClintock's University of Chicago research team asked women to sniff boxes containing a single t-shirt. Each t-shirt was worn by one of 6 men of diverse backgrounds. One man emerged as the most pleasant smelling. Rather, the women preferred men who had immune system genes similar to their own. The analysis showed that these men possessed a gene that had been inherited from the women's fathers. Research suggests that scents may trigger pleasant moods and give a boost to worker performance. Social psychologist Robert Barron, who has studied fragrance effects, has patented and is marketing a device that emits pleasant scents called the PPS, Personal Productivity Privacy System. It combines fragrance release with white noise generator and an air filter. After testing dozens of smell, Barron found that lemon and light floral had broad appeal. Pine was the least popular odor, and is a marketing disc producing odors with the PPS on much larger scale. Shimizu Corporation has also patented an odor delivery for commercial buildings. For example, it pumps a citrus odor through an office building ventilation ducts every 2 minutes. This fragrance sense can be fundamental to controlling conditions for office workers. They cite that the month-long study of Japanese key punchers in which those who inhaled the lemon aroma make 54% fewer errors than those who sniff plain air. While citrus odors seem to make people more alert, other smells such as spiced apples seem to aid relaxation. Researchers are investigating the various fragrances in diverse settings. In some cases, they have developed dramatic successes. For example, Susan Schiffman of Duke University explored how pleasant odors may influence the disposition of New York City subway riders. In pumping scents through one subway car and not another, she reported finding that some food odors cut shoving and pushing by 40%. She also reported success in using apricot scent to help patients at a weight loss clinic to relax. Many overweight people, she claims, eat compulsively when they're under stress, and the aroma technique has proven beneficial. William Redd and Sharon Main of Sloan Kettering Cancer in New York City used a vanilla scent to lessen patient anxiety. Those who detected the scent and perceived it as a pleasant reported a drop in anxiety by as much as 65%. Barron and his colleagues also found that shoppers at Crossgate Mall in upstate New York were more likely to help a stranger if they smelled roasting coffee or baking cookies. There's nothing magical, Barron said. When you put people in a good mood, they become more helpful. Alan Hirsch, a neurologist at the Smell and Taste Treatment and Research Foundation, recently reported intriguing fragrance effects on female sexual arousal. He tested vaginal blood flow in 30 women wearing masks suffused with various odors. Anything over 10% boost in blood flow was regarded as significantly stimulating. Surprisingly, good and plenty licorice candy combined with cucumber increased the flow the most, 14%. Baby powder produced a 13% boost. Lavender combined with pumpkin pie followed an 11%. Hirsch's earlier research found that licorice and lavender were also arousing for men. What were the turnoffs? Cherry cut flowers by 18%. Charcoal barbecue by 15%, and men's cologne by 1%. Reporting at the National Meeting of American Psychomatic Society, Hirsch suggested that odors that excite women tend to be fresh-smelling or nostalgic reminders of childhood. It may be about safety and security then you're comfortable enough to feel more sexual, he concluded. William Denber, a psychologist at the University of Cincinnati, who's also researching fragrance effects, is cautious in drawing any final conclusions. We need to test more fragrances, he says. We may not see anything more than a placebo effect. People may simply do better when they believe the fragrance will help. Moreover, his own findings have indicated that small effects improving work performance about the same amount that 1 cup of coffee does. He reported that subjects' performance improved by about 15% overall when they were given 30-second bursts of air scented with peppermint and mugent, which smells like lily of the valley, every 5 minutes during a 40-minute task. Denber argues that it is premature for employers to buy fragrances to make their workers more alert. People resent being manipulated, he concludes, and thus in the long range the strategy could be counterproductive. In reviewing 11 published studies involving the connection between odor and performance, Susan Naskow reports that 5 of these showed no influence at all. The other 6 were equally divided between positive and negative effects. So the ability to identify small peaks during early adulthood, but steadily declines after that. Women are better at detecting odors than men. The brain region of smell, in red here, is closely connected with the brain regions involved with memory or the limbic system. That is why strong memories are made through the sense of smell. Kinesthesis is the system for sensing the position and movement of individual parts. Sensors in the muscles, tendons, and joints are continually providing our brain with information. As a companion vestibular sense monitors the head and thus the body's position and movement. The biological gyroscope for this sense of equilibrium are in the inner ear. This now concludes Chapter 5 on sensation.